Welcome to the original Wasco County Courthouse 2021 forums. We do these annually, every Saturday in February. We have bad weather here, of course, in the Dalles, so it's actually working out well that we have a Zoom meeting today, so we don't have to cancel and reschedule. We normally pass the hat during these events, so if you're so inclined, you can make a donation on our website to help us with expenses that we do continue to have, even though the courthouse has mostly been closed due to COVID. Today's program is Thunder Go North, the hunt for Sir Francis Drake's Fair and Good Bay. And here to introduce our speaker is Vice President Eric Gleason.
Hello, welcome to today's program. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce to all of you Melissa Darby. I've had the pleasure of knowing Melissa since 1983, I guess, when we worked together on an archaeological dig up in north central Washington. And one of the things about Melissa that you'll probably see from her presentation today is that she's really always had an infectious joy and curiosity about archaeology and history. And it really shows in her research and how she kind of went through all of these different channels to try and really tell the story of Sir Francis Drake and his stop here on the northwest coast of North America. So, and you know, her book is a fascinating read because she pulls in not only the story of Francis Drake, but also the story of later historians as they try and piece together his journey and where he stopped. And she's, of course, all of those people are real characters, and she's really delved into them and their stories, and in the process has uncovered a lot of history that had been kind of hidden. So without further ado, here's Melissa.
Welcome to the original Wasco County Courthouse 2021 forums. We do these annually, every Saturday in February. We have bad weather here, of course, in the Dalles, so it's actually working out well that we have a Zoom meeting today, so we don't have to cancel and reschedule. We normally pass the hat during these events, so if you're so inclined, you can make a donation on our website to help us with expenses that we do continue to have, even though the courthouse has mostly been closed due to COVID. Today's program is Thunder Go North, the hunt for Sir Francis Drake's Fair and Good Bay. And here to introduce our speaker is Vice President Eric Gleason.
Hello, welcome to today's program. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce to all of you Melissa Darby. I've had the pleasure of knowing Melissa since 1983, I guess, when we worked together on an archaeological dig up in north central Washington. And one of the things about Melissa that you'll probably see from her presentation today is that she's really always had an infectious joy and curiosity about archaeology and history. And it really shows in her research and how she kind of went through all of these different channels to try and really tell the story of Sir Francis Drake and his stop here on the northwest coast of North America. So, and you know, her book is a fascinating read because she pulls in not only the story of Francis Drake, but also the story of later historians as they try and piece together his journey and where he stopped. And she's, of course, all of those people are real characters, and she's really delved into them and their stories, and in the process has uncovered a lot of history that had been kind of hidden. So without further ado, here's Melissa.
It's been 442 years since Francis Drake and his company in two ships, the Golden Hind and a small ship we only know as Tello's bark, landed somewhere on the west coast. This was during what became known as the famous Voyage, where about 80 men and a pregnant Black woman named Maria landed on this unknown beach, which no one has ever really been sure where it was. They unloaded their captured treasure and built a rudimentary fort where they set up their tents and stored their treasure. They rested and refreshed in this fair bay, what they called their Fair and Good Bay, for at least 5 weeks, but it could been as long as 10 weeks. The records are inconsistent. So I became interested in this. Oops, I dropped myself. I became interested in this subject through the native food that Drake described. I've been studying the Native American use of wapato since graduate school. Wapato is a Chinook jargon word for this root of the Sagittaria latifolia plant. This plant is common in wetland environments throughout North America, but especially prolific in the Willamette Valley and along the lower Columbia River. Wapato can be eaten raw, and ethnographic accounts talk about the Native Americans eating it either raw, baked in the ashes, or made into cakes, which they called chaplel, which is another Chinook jargon word. So it was brought to my attention that when Drake landed and he met the Native Americans, they brought him a root they called peta, which is awfully close to the word pota. And he described that they made him into bread cakes that they called cheap, which is awfully close to chaplil. So my interest was thoroughly aroused in this, and I decided to investigate further. So let's start at the beginning. Drake's voyage began in 1577. It was called the Famous Voyage, but however famous it was shrouded in secrecy and mystery. It was a secret voyage conducted under the guise of piracy. The secret plan called for Drake to lead a squadron of ships to South America, travel through the Strait of Magellan and into the Pacific Ocean. Part of the purpose was to look for places to trade and also to find places to colonize. This was before England had any colonies in Virginia or anywhere. They were to harass the Spanish and intercept the Spanish ships carrying treasure from Peru to the crossing at Panama. They were also to explore as far north along the coast of America as they could to look for the western entrance to the Northwest Passage. On board was Drake's brother Thomas, his cousin William Hawkins were officers. His cabin boy was his young cousin John Drake. Diego, the former slave from Panama, sailed as Drake's manservant and was just a paid member of the crew because there was no slavery in England at this time, and Black people were just part of the populace. The crew consisted of about 164 men who served as men-at-arms and common sailors. The fleet carried cooks, a surgeon, a surgeon's boy, smiths, carpenters, and coopers. The Pelican carried a forge. On board were musicians, including a drummer, a trumpeter, and 2 or more violas. Officers of the voyage included a chaplain, Francis Fletcher, and various gentlemen, adventurers, or noblemen who were investors in the enterprise or who were supported by their patrons at court. So Francis Drake and his fleet of 5 ships set out from Plymouth. The crew thought they were going to Alexandria, Egypt, to load a cargo of currants. But soon after they sailed, it was revealed to the crew that their destination was the South Sea and the Pacific. This famous voyage became the second circumnavigation of the earth and the first to return with its commander, Francis Drake, and a load of treasure. Only one ship, the Pelican, which was renamed the Golden Hind on the voyage, made the complete voyage. So as they sailed south, they captured their first ship off the Cape Verdes island along with her pilot. So now the fleet consisted of 6 ships. They wintered in Patagonia, where they broke up the smaller ships for firewood, and with 3 ships remaining, they entered the strait. And so taken from east to west, the Strait of Magellan is typically dangerous in contrary winds, and the winds are typically contrary. And once they emerged into the Pacific, a relentless gale drove them 200 leagues south of the strait. The wind was almost continuous. For much of the time, they couldn't bear any sail. The crews were weakened by short rations and worn out by working in the bitter cold, where monstrous waves battered them constantly for 52 days. This was an unaccountably long time in these conditions. They became separated. The little ship known as the Marigold disappeared. And Captain Winter aboard the Elizabeth abandoned the voyage and headed back to England. Drake and his crew in the Golden Hind were alone in the Pacific. This expanse of open sea south of Magellan Strait astonished them because up to then they thought that South America was connected to Antarctica and the only path was through the Strait of Magellan. So even today, this is called Drake's Passage. Oops, there's the Golden Hind. It was renamed right at this time. So they sailed north. On an island off of the coast of southern Chile, they were attacked by natives. One man was killed, many were wounded, and Drake received an arrow wound into his cheek and one on his head, and his assistant Diego received almost 20 arrow wounds. Though they were small arrows, that was a lot, and he died later on the crossing from over the Pacific. The little fleet of one continued north. The weather improved, their wounds healed, and they began raiding towns and capturing and rifling through ships as they worked their way north. Their biggest prize was a treasure ship that they captured off of the coast of Panama that was heavily laden with silver, and they even ballasted the Golden Hind with the silver bars. Further north, they captured a ship that they kept. We don't know the name of the ship, but it was referred to as Telos Bark after the name of the owner. Off the coast of Guatemala, Drake captured a ship that was carrying Chinese porcelain wares and some cloth, and most importantly, the sailing directions and charts that would later lead them across the Pacific Ocean. They also brought on board Maria, a Black woman who had been enslaved by the ship's owner. So their last landfall before heading out to sea was at Guatalco, where Drake, here, it was right here. Here's where Drake freed 2 Black men who were at court under trial for trying to burn down the town. So including Diego, there were 4 Black Africans on board by the time they left Mexico for points north. So the Golden Hind was best before the wind. It was a square-sailed ship. With Telos Bark as their companion, they sailed northwest out into the Pacific to catch the right type of wind that would bring them north. The Hakluyt account, which is the official account, said he took what is called a Spanish course out to sea and then on the North Pacific Gyre, which would put them in a position to reconnoiter for the Northwest Passage. How far north they went is a matter of debate, but the record shows that Drake was in search of the Northwest Passage, and it was thought it would be easier to navigate from the west to the east because of the prevailing westerlies. The year before Drake sailed, his colleague Martin Frobisher had caused quite a stir with his announcement that he had found the eastern entrance to the strait at latitude 60 degrees north, which meant that Asia was quite close. And to prove it, he brought back 2 Asians, which were not really Asians, they were Inuit people. If Drake had found a passage, what a coup that would have been. It would have been a shortcut home with the wind at his back. They did not find the Northwest Passage, and it was the summertime of 1579. The Golden Hind was taking on water. The stormy seas had opened her seams and widened the leak she'd had in her hull since she was off the coast of Panama. Drake and his crew were searching the rough coast for a well-protected cove with a sandy beach so they could careen her, that is, carefully lean her over on one side and then the other to get to the leak and clean the hull and recaulk it. By this point of the voyage, Drake had resolved to cross the Pacific. In fact, they had no choice but to circumnavigate the globe. They found a bay that they called their Fair and Good Bay and spent, either 5 or 10 weeks there while they repaired their ship and explored the country. Once the leak was fixed and the ship floated and ready, the crew prepared to embark on the first leg of the return journey, which would take them across the Pacific. Just before they sailed, Drake erected a firm post which he attached a metal plaque engraved with a formal land claim in the name of Queen Elizabeth for the territory they named Nova Albion. They left Tello's bark on the west coast, and that ship and her crew of about 20 are lost to history. Drake and the Golden Hind and the 60 or so that remained crossed the Pacific and stopped and refreshed on an island that they named Crab Island, that they called it a paradise that afforded all necessities of provision, which refreshed our wearied bodies so that the sickly, weak, and decayed, as many of us seemed to be before our coming hither, we in a short space grew all of us to be strong, lusty, and healthful persons. So on Crab Island, they left the now heavily pregnant Maria and her 2 Black companions that they had brought from Mexico. They left them with a quantity of rice, some seeds for planting, and a way of making fire. So after bidding farewell to Maria and the Cimarrones, as they were called, the voyagers headed toward Java. They hit a reef, almost wrecked, and encountered storms that almost drove them up on a lee shore. Once at Java, they purchased some ornate daggers, a sample of Java papyrus, and replenished their store of rice. In the Indian Ocean, they almost perished for want of water off Mozambique and rounded the Cape of Good Hope. They saw elephants when they landed in Guinea to buy lemons and other fruits. On the 26th of September, 1580, a crisp westerly brought them into their home port of Plymouth. The famous voyage took 2 years, 10 months, and a few odd days. Even before Drake could disembark the Golden Hind in Plymouth Harbor, a messenger rode out to him and told him that he was in the Queen's bad graces on account of all the depredations he did to the Spanish, and that the Spanish ambassador was asking for restitution for his robberies. Subsequently, the crew was made to swear an oath of secrecy not to reveal where they had been on pain of death. Drake was disavowed. They called him a pirate in public, and the Privy Council initiated a so-called investigation into the voyage. This was a cover story. Francis Drake was a hero. Within a week of his return, Queen Elizabeth quietly summoned him to court and told him that he had to fear nothing. Though she confiscated his logs and charts, he was knighted a few months later. Sadly, all his records of the voyage, his diary and so forth, have never surfaced and are believed to have been destroyed in a fire a few years later. So what is the evidence for a more northerly landing on the shores of what is now Oregon? There's one artifact, maybe more. There's some map evidence. There's descriptions of Native American material culture, including architecture, clothing, and foods. The flora and fauna that Drake described while he was here, and a native word list. The theory that Drake landed in California was not always universally accepted. In the early 20th century, new clues to Drake's movements in the Pacific came to light with the findings of Zelia Nuttall, the famous archaeologist and anthropologist. In February of 1908, while working in the old colonial archives in Mexico City, she came across a trove of contemporary documents about Drake and his voyage and his actions and depredations in New Spain. So further research in Europe led her to the conclusion that Drake landed on the northwest coast of America rather than the oft-cited California shore. This was a turnabout, and the California historians tried to play it down because by then Drake was a hero to California. The original accounts by Drake and his chaplain mentioned that the Native American people had canoes and that their houses were dug into the ground and the roofs were made of planks joined at the top and covered with dirt. Inside the house, it was like being in the scuttle of a ship, they said. So this is a house built by the Tolowa who lived on the southern Oregon coast, but it's typical of the native architecture found on central and southern Oregon coast. The Miwok and Pomo of the coast of California, by comparison, where most people thought Drake landed, had mat and grass houses that were built on the grade and had willow bough frames. And these people had tule raft boats rather than canoes. So Zelia and Nuttall found that the Northwest coast was a better fit for these and other ethnographic comparisons. So there is scant artifactual evidence of Drake on the Northwest coast. An English silver shilling dating from about 1560 was reportedly found on the beach at Nehalem Bay after the 1962 Columbus Day storm, though the source of this information and the coin remain elusive. Recently, another coin was found near Victoria that had a date of 1551, but it was not found by an archaeologist. It was found by a collector, so the provenience is a little questionable. There was a metal chisel found in a house pit near Yachats that was dated by an archaeologist to about 1600. While Nuttall postulated Drake's Fair Bay may be near Cape Flattery, several theorists have suggested that Drake's Bay was Whale Cove on the Oregon coast just north of Newport. It's a small cove protected from the prevailing winds and currents by a basalt peninsula on the north. The geographic features seem to match Drake's map of the cove, and Whale Cove does have a gently sloping sandy bottom, and in the summer there are few breakers, which is an important point for careening a ship. You don't want them to have breakers breaking against your ship. This is the Hondias map of his bay called Port Nova Albion. It was the name given to the territory that Drake claimed on the whole west coast north of the Spanish territory. The Native Americans welcomed them, treated them as if they were gods. They burned, as they thought they were gods, so they would burn things in the fire as if the smoke would carry them right to Drake while he was standing right there. And the Native Americans never were quite dissuaded that Drake was not a god. Drake and his men even ate food in front of him to prove them that they were just men. It didn't work too well. Anyway, Drake gave the natives cloth and beads, and the natives gave Drake baskets and shell bead necklaces and feather headdresses. And Drake mistook the feather headdresses for them giving him the crown of the territory that made him the king of the land. That was certainly a mistake. Drake could have navigated the Golden Hind and Telos bark into Whale Cove. This is a scale. This is the Golden Hind to scale. So he had plenty of room. These are in fathoms. He had plenty of room to navigate to a possible place right here where he careened it at a sandy beach. This is the basalt arm that protects it, especially in the summer. So he could have been here. Here's Dead Horse Creek, and here's a big cape right here. During Prohibition, Whale Cove was referred to as Bootlegger Bay. It was one of a few hidden bays that smugglers could navigate because, and it became famous for its association with the Canadian trade in black market liquor. So vessels would run down the coast and sneak into the cove and transfer the liquor to the beach in skiffs for distribution throughout by shore gangs. In February of 1932, one of the bootlegger ships, the 36-foot Sea Island out of Victoria, attempted to enter the bay at night during a storm, and it crashed into this prominent rock, burned and caught fire and sank. And this is now known as Rum Runner's Rock. So looking northwest, this is the basalt arm that protects the bay. And this is where I think that the Golden Hind and Telos bark were careened. The geomorphologists that studied Whale Cove concluded that due to the basalt-based rock in the cove, the shape of the cove would not have changed greatly in 400 years, though the Oregon coast is very dynamic. And there was a earthquake in 1700 that may have dropped the elevation by, who knows, 3 feet or so. And then this bank was overtopped by a tsunami wave, which may have erased any evidence of Drake. Drake's map has this island that lies just off the peninsula. The island off the North Peninsula was a point of inconsistency between Drake's maps, but when I found the LiDAR, I realized that there's a shoal here, and that could have been an island maybe 400 years ago when Drake was charting these shores. This is the Dudley manuscript map that's in the Bavarian State Library in Munich. Robert Dudley was a favorite of Queen Elizabeth, as was his father. He wrote that he had his information from an English pilot. This map is from the 1630 about. His depiction of the Fair Bay includes the depths of the bay in fathoms, which is remarkably similar to the depths of the bay in fathoms of Whale Cove. And Dudley's chart depicts a creek entering here and a Native American settlement about where one is, where an archaeological site is now. The names recorded on this map may be names from Drake's own charts. If so, these names may be the only record of what Drake and his men saw on the coast that we have. In general, they don't describe geographical features, but they're evocative, such as further north from here is the River of Holy Sparrows, Cape of Sardines, and the River of Kingfishers. South of Porto Nova, Albion, we have the coast of the Guide, and then we have the Cape of the Canoe Trees, the Gulf of the Canoe Trees, and the River of the Canoe Trees, which I think maybe Yaquina Bay. And here we have the coast of the Canoe Trees continuing. And then we have a bay with 2 rivers entering it, which may be Alsea Bay. And then down here they have desert land. Desert land may correspond to the desert-like sand dune hills known as the Coos Bay Dune Sheet. The dune sheet extends over 80 kilometers and is continuous on the coastline. And it's commonly called the Oregon Dunes, and it's about a degree south of Whale Cove. So it's likely that Drake may have sailed down on these latitudes before he headed out to sea on his way back. Though Zelia Nuttall's essay on her cultural comparisons between the people Drake encountered and the people of the Northwest Coast is lost, I feel sure that she may have found some obvious comparisons. So 3 days after Drake landed, a high king, he said, of the native people arrived with his entourage. Drake said that the men were wearing knitted headbands decorated with cut feathers, and some had headwear stuck with the seed fluff. Drake said that this plant fluff was from a plant they described as looking like bolted lettuce, and it grew up in the hills, and the natives highly valued it. This seed fluff was likely fireweed, which grows in the hills on clear cuts, and the fiber has a long staple and looks like bolted lettuce when the plant is mature. The knitted headbands Drake described were likely made from mountain goat wool, like this woman is, this is a Makah woman wearing mountain goat wool regalia, which was often augmented with the fluff of fireweed. And we know that weaving was a tradition on the Oregon coast because at Seaside, this spindle whorl and some loom parts were found in an archaeological site. The Coast Miwok people California do not have a tradition of weaving, and mountain goats were not present so much in their region, and actually they weren't present in their region. And there's no ethnographic record of fireweed or any other use of any plant fluff on the California coast, but it's frequently mentioned in the ethnographies of the people of the Northwest coast. So this animal is a Cape Hyrax. They called it the Barbary coney. And when Drake arrived wherever his bay was, he said there was a certain coney that looked like this coney, except it had a long, bald tail. And it carried food in its cheeks, and it lived in warrens in the summertime. Early explorers to the Northwest coast, and Oregon in particular, noted that the natives here wore fur robes made with the pelts of muskrats. Muskrat robes were reported by Lewis and Clark and John Kirk Townsend. Here's a Cowlitz woman painted by Paul Kane wearing such a robe, and these robes were lightweight, waterproof, and warm. When Drake and his officers went into the interior of the country exploring, they found a multitude of these little animals living in warrens, and they described it as having a long bald tail, paws like a mole, and it carries its food in its cheeks, and people use them for both meat and their pelts. So, muskrats have long bald tails, live in warrens in the summer, and have hands like moles and carry food in their cheeks. And they live in the extensive wetlands found in Western Oregon. But the California Drake scholars have conjectured that Drake's coney was a ground squirrel or perhaps a pocket gopher, because pocket gophers have bald tails, but pocket gophers are no bigger than a hamster, really, and you hardly ever see them above ground, and they're pretty solitary and subterranean. And against the squirrel conjecture, if Drake saw a squirrel, I think he would have said it was a squirrel, and squirrels don't typically have bald tails. So anyway, I think Zelia figured that one out too. As she developed her thesis about the northern limits of Drake in the Pacific, she traveled to Cape Flattery on the northwest coast of the state of Washington, where one of the manuscripts, John Drake's manuscript, said that they had landed. Here she met people that were Makah people, and she became convinced she had found people like the ones Drake encountered. Though she was one of the founders of the Department of Anthropology at Berkeley and one of the first women honored by being selected as a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, every editorial board turned her down, and her work was foiled, and she never was able to publish. She was marginalized. In California, Drake's swashbuckling legend was being polished by the fraternal order known as the Native Sons of the Golden West, a group who extolled California history and didn't allow Hispanics or any people of color into their ranks. And Drake was their golden son. And to lose him by the efforts of a Hispanic and Irish woman, she was both Hispanic and Irish, who was a single mother, a divorced Catholic, and one who preferred the company of other equally beautiful and accomplished women. Well, that was too much for these men to contemplate. So Nuttall's work was never published, and except for an outline of her thesis, is now lost. So let's look at why there is so much confusion as to where Drake sailed and landed his little ship. The official account that was published a few years after Drake returned was published by the Queen's publisher Richard Hakluyt in 1589, and he described the northernmost limit of the voyage at 42 degrees, which is on the southern Oregon coast, and that the landing occurred further south down here at 38, which is basically Drake's Bay or around San Francisco. The Californians put a lot of stock in the printed Hakluyt account, even though there was other material that contradicted these latitudes. And this is where the confusion of the landing began. The contention I present here is that the official account was designed to claim more land than England was entitled. This is Spanish territory I believe Drake wanted to claim all the way down to the boundary. If Drake was at 48 degrees when he came in from the Pacific and then sailed down to 44 degrees to look for his fair and good bay, England had no right to a wide swath of land south of 44 degrees. I argue here that the latitudes reported in the Hakluyt account were intended to claim land Drake did not see, and it was a trick in order to leave no gap and no unclaimed territory, therefore checking Spanish expansion on the coast. I found some proof of this idea. Historians had known about this manuscript for years. It describes Drake's voyage, and it's an abstract from an original account written by someone on the voyage. Historians have known about it, but no one to date has figured out what it was. But I figured out that it was actually a draft in progress of Hakluyt's chapter. So whoever wrote that chapter or that account of Drake's famous voyage, this is the draft of that final chapter. It's clearly a manuscript and a draft in progress. There's a number of interlinear additions. Some passages are crossed out, and editorial notations and marks in the margin saying, move this text here, and so forth. In the margin of the notes page at the end of the document is a sketch of a pointing finger. Here's a pointing finger, pointing hand. Next, with an instruction to put this bit of text about a Portuguese pilot into the main text. And there's only one mark of a pointing hand in the main text. And you look at it, and it's situated in the margin just below a sentence about Tom Moon taking a gold chain from a Spanish gentleman. The editor's instruction was carried out because positioned just after Moon takes the gold chain in the printed account by Hakluyt, is recited the text about the Portuguese pilot. So this is definitely an edited a draft version of what was happening with the final chapter and account of Drake's voyage. This correspondence couldn't be a coincidence, and 2 points of importance are that Drake's Fair and Good Bay was at 44 degrees north, which is about Whale Cove, and the text specifically mentions his search for the Northwest Passage. Besides the higher points of latitude on the coast, discreetly censored from the published version is the pregnancy of Maria and her abandonment on an island with no water, and other sensitive information that Hakluyt would, necessarily need to put in the chapter. So Zelia gave up trying to publish her findings, and she died in Mexico in 1933. Taking up the cause was this woman. This is Eva Taylor. She was a historian and geographer from Birkbeck College, London, who challenged the Drake and California theory in a series of articles in the 1930s. She had by chance found this manuscript with the plans or the plot of Drake's voyage. It had been overlooked, its edges are burnt, but it still retains most of the detailed instructions for the voyage, which called for Drake to pass through the Strait of Magellan and find lands not in the possession of any Christian prince. And it's no small point that the voyage was conducted with Queen Elizabeth's support, and it was launched as a covert operation as in the guise of piracy. Taylor also discovered and published a passage from the private diary of Richard Maddox, who was on the follow-up voyage. Also, John Drake was on the follow-up voyage. And it contained the categorical statement that Drake reached 48 degrees north, which agrees with a later account by John Drake, and that they careened the Golden Hind at 44 degrees north. Taylor wrote, "Now there can have been no possible reason for any falsification of the facts in a shipboard discussion or in a diary jotting meant for the writer's eye alone. Thus, it would appear that Drake's anchorage must be sought in Oregon rather than California." Oh, so she wrote that, and that was throwing the gauntlet down. In the Maddox document, she found a word list of the Native Americans who Drake met at the landing. And when she showed this vocabulary list to a linguist, an expert on Northwest Coast languages, he said that it possibly could be Chinookan language from the Northwest Coast. And I postulate it was actually, some of the words were actually Chinook jargon, a derivative of Chinookan. This is only 3 of the words. There's 7 phrases, words and phrases that I'm not bringing up right now, but let's look at these. We've already talked about peta, the root, which I think is wapado, and cheap, Drake's word for the bread cake, which is sapolil or caplil for the bread cake. The other one I want to talk about is hio, which Drake thought meant this is a king, because when it was first spoken to him, it was 2 emissaries came down the trail and said, hio, hio. And Drake, being the Elizabethan, thought, oh, here comes the king. It means here comes the king, because he could see the processional coming down the path. Hio means gathering, and when it's used twice, such as hio, it means big formal gathering. And like Nuttall, Eva Taylor's findings were not liked by the powers that be in California, and they tried to dismiss their findings like they did Nuttall's. Just as Taylor's work was finally changing the paradigm, the Northwest Coast theory of Drake's Landing was gaining traction. It was dramatically eclipsed when the alleged plate made by Drake to mark his land claim was found on a hillside above San Francisco Bay. This is the plate of brass. The man on the right is Herbert Bolton, and the man on the left is Shin. He's the man who found it. Bolton declared it authentic almost immediately, and he arranged for Mr. Shin to receive a reward for finding the artifact of $3,500, which was a lot of money. This was during the Depression, and Mr. Shin bought a house with that. Bolton was famous before this, and he became even more famous. Before the plate of brass was found, student enrollment at Berkeley had dropped off, and the Depression had slowed the funds from his benefactors, including the native sons of the Golden West, who gave scholarships every year to 2 of his students. The plate did not just put Bolton in the limelight, it also attracted new students and bolstered his private support for Bolton's programs. I found that it was the famous historian himself, Herbert Bolton, the man who authenticated the plate, who was also the hoaxer who made it. I figured this out by looking in old newspaper accounts of what he did, and he would find treasure maps and authenticate them. And the Bancroft Library has a lot of his letters and notes about these things, and he was involved in several hoaxes. One involved a pirate treasure chest found in a cave. He had a hand in the Chowan River Dare Stone, allegedly carved with a message from one of the lost colonists of Roanoke. There was millions found in a cave, and he said that he's the one that led the finder to it. And so I figured out that Bolton was a serial hoaxer. And as the biggest cheerleader for the plate of brass, it seems obvious that he created the plate of brass. His animosity towards Nuttall and Taylor was clear in his letters and papers, so it seemed that he created the plate to shut down the theories of Nuttall and Taylor. It seems that Bolton had created sort of an Easter egg. He had planted the plate and was encouraging his students to go out to Marin County and look for it. This is archaeologist Robert Heiser, a longtime anthropology professor at Berkeley. When he was a student in 1935 or 36, he took a course from Bolton at Berkeley, during which Bolton talked about Drake and pointed out that no one knew where he had landed. He told his students to keep their eyes out for the brass plate, which he said he'd left. So Heiser asked him, should we go out and dig in the shell mounds? And Bolton arranged for him to receive some funds to help with that project. He was very encouraging, according to Heiser. But after over 30 excavations between 1937 and 1974 in and around Drake's Bay, San Francisco Bay, Bolinas Bay, and the rock outcrop where the plate was found and other locations, they found nothing that could be associated with Drake the Englishman. So between 1937 and 1976, the Drake plate of brass was considered authentic, but there was no agreement among academics and non-academics as to the exact location of Drake's anchorage. They thought that maybe Drake came in around Coos Bay, and Drake did go into what was called a bad bay before he found his fair and good bay, and they conjectured that it must be Chetco Cove or Coos Bay or South Cove. And then he came down here, and he was either at Drake's Bay, San Quentin Bay, somewhere in San Francisco Bay, or Bolinas Lagoon. There's clubs that support each of these locations, and they fight among themselves. And in Oregon, there's at least 2 or 3 different groups that support that Drake was at one bay or another. So since the 1970s, this question has been a tug of war between non-academic proponents who assert their favorite bay is the one. So I did find some evidence that Bolton was the hoaxer. Just before the big celebration that marked the 400th anniversary of Drake in California, it was important to figure out where Drake's Fair Bay was. There were rumors that the plate of brass was a hoax, so a new investigation in the authenticity of the plate and who made it was conducted by James Hart. This is James Hart of the Bancroft Library. He followed in the steps of Herbert Bolton, being director of the Bancroft. The publicity of the investigation prompted a woman named Dolores Scoble to contact him and tell him what she knew. She said that when she was 12 or 13 years old, her father took her and her mother to the home of a historian who lived in the hills above Berkeley, above the Berkeley campus. There, her dad met with the historian and 2 other men, and Dolores was supposed to watch the 2 young kids who lived there while her mother visited with the historian's wife. At some point, Dolores left the company of the 2 young kids and went out to see what the men were doing in the garage. I think I would do that. Dolores watched them and heard them laughing and discussing a metal plate. She remembered that one of the men was a newspaper reporter. After they left the house, her mother was unhappy and told her she was very unhappy about the plate and that it was a joke about Drake claiming land in the name of Queen Elizabeth. Among the revelations from Dolores was the plate hoax was initiated by this Berkeley area historian, and it was made around 1917 when she was 12 or 13. These events took place 20 years prior to the eventual launch of the hoax when Eva Taylor was rabble-rousing, but it was manufactured at the critical moment when Zelia et al.'s theory of Drake's Landing was gaining some traction. Hart must have looked into how many historians lived in the hills above Berkeley in 1917 and which ones had 2 young children. This would have been a short list, and Herbert Bolton would have been at the top of that list. If Hart suspected or knew the historian was Bolton and had chosen to publicly discuss Bolton as the hoaxer, it would have been sensational because this was during the run-up to the 400th anniversary of Drake's landing and his voyage, and they were planning a year-long celebration in California, a celebration of Drake. And this was the kind of information that would have embarrassed the University of California, the Bancroft Library in California, in front of a worldwide audience. So he left clues in his file for another historian to find and piece together later. Thanks, James. This is a statue of Drake in Plymouth. Shakespearean scholars suggest that the circumnavigations by Drake and later by Cavendish were such triumphs for England that Shakespeare commemorated these voyages when he named his theater the Globe. Additionally, the native events at the Fair and Good Bay may have provided the playwright with inspiration for The Tempest, which began with a storm and a shipwreck and featured a native who worshipped the new arrivals as brave gods and a shipwrecked woman who had a baby. Drake and his crew were on the northwest coast of America in 1579 during a minor sojourn in the circumnavigation of the world. I have attempted to sort out the history of the controversy of the landing in the latitudes. The plate of brass confounded the question for years, and it was an elaborate hoax designed to fool the scientific community and the public to support the contention that the landing occurred along the California coast. So the evidence that I presented here for Drake landing on the Oregon coast is stronger than the corresponding evidence for his landing on the California coast. So the Northwest Coast theory of Drake's landing is, however, at present unimaginable to many scholars, and uncritical acceptance of the dominant paradigm of a California landing is understandably the norm, but in view of the important and deeply interesting questions involved, the vexed question of where Drake and company landed and repaired the Golden Hind in the summer of 1579 deserves to be fully reconsidered.